Welcome to this Wednesday's edition of Market Mantra, the program in which we give you a complete update on the economic, business and stock market news of the day. I'm Arjun Chaudhary and with me is my co-anchor in Hindi, Manoj Pathak.
नमस्कार। मार्केट मंत्र के ताजा अंक में आपका स्वागत है। आधे घंटे के इस कार्यक्रम में हमेशा की तरह हम देश और दुनिया की चुनी हुई कारोबारी, आर्थिक और शेयर बाजार से संबंधित ताजा खबरों को लेकर हाजिर हैं। हमारे साथ खबरों पर चर्चा के लिए आज स्टूडियो में आमंत्रित हैं बिजनेस स्टैंडर्ड के एडिटोरियल डायरेक्टर ए.के. भट्टाचार्य। ए.के. नमस्कार, कार्यक्रम में आपका स्वागत है।
नमस्कार।
आइए शुरुआत करते हैं अंग्रेजी में हेडलाइन से, जिसे लेकर मौजूद हैं अर्जुन चौधरी।
The GDP of the country grows at 13.5% in the April to June quarter of the current fiscal. Asian stock markets logged losses following overnight losses in the US dollar, and Brent crude oil prices fall to trade around $96 per barrel.
देश में चालू वित्त वर्ष की पहली तिमाही में सकल घरेलू उत्पाद वृद्धि दर 13.5% पर पहुंची। अमेरिकी शेयर बाजार में कल हुई गिरावट के बाद आज एशियाई बाजार भी फिसले और ब्रेंट कच्चे तेल की कीमत घटकर $96 प्रति बैरल पर आई।
In our top story, gross domestic product GDP of the country for the April to June quarter of the current financial year grew 13.5%. According to the provisional estimates by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation released today, the gross domestic product had rose 20.1% in the corresponding quarter of the previous fiscal year. The real GDP at constant 2011 to 12 prices in the first quarter of 2022-23 is estimated to attain a level of 36.85 lakh crore rupees as against 32.46 lakh crore rupees in the first quarter of the last fiscal. Once again, I would like to welcome our expert on this program, Market Mantra. We are joined by Shri A.K. Bhattacharya, who is the Editorial Director of Business Standard. A warm welcome to you, sir, on the program.
Thank you.
So good to have you, AKB, as we fondly call him, on Market Mantra. Just for simplicity, we are looking at the real GDP figures, which is adjusting for inflation and not the nominal, and these are not estimates. These are computed figures by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. What is this telling us in terms of the growth in the economy? How is it that we are growing at this rate, whereas China, for instance, is showing almost negligible to negative growth?
Well, China is showing right now 0.4% growth in a comparable figure. But I think what these numbers, 13.5% real GDP growth in the first quarter of the current financial year, these figures tell us quite a few things. Number one, you have to see that in the first quarter of last financial year, the growth was over 20%. Now, so clearly, first quarter of last year, 20% growth, and now it is 13% growth, so relatively high growth on a high growth base. So it seems, it appears, and the numbers tell us that the economy in the first quarter has done reasonably well. Whether the size of the economy has taken us back to the pre-COVID size is something that the closer look at the numbers will tell us. If you drill down these numbers, they also tell you about how the different sectors of the economy has done. For example, in the first quarter, agriculture has grown by around 4%. Now, this is an increase over around 2.5% growth rate in the first quarter of last year. So clearly, agriculture this season, this quarter, has done better than what it was in the
Just to
year.
interrupt you briefly here, AKB, agriculture, forestry and fishing has witnessed 4.5% rise in gross value added. So for the benefit of our listeners, what is GVA?
The gross value added is a figure that does not have the taxes and other elements that go into the government's kitty. What it has is the value added component, which means that if you are buying seeds of 10 rupees and buying other various things of fertilizers of 10 rupees.
Inputs.
20 rupees inputs, and your actual sale price is 25 rupees. So what you have got is 5 rupees gross value added. So that's roughly is the estimate. But coming back to that earlier point, what I would like to draw your attention to is that apart from agriculture, a key sector of the economy, which is manufacturing, has come up with a growth rate of only around 4%. Now that is almost and probably less than agriculture, and that is manufacturing is supposed to give us more jobs, give us more buoyancy, more vitality into the system, in the economy. So 4% growth in agriculture, very good, but 4% in manufacturing, not very good. So it's a mixed picture. 13.5% picture growth is good, but if you look at the nominal growth figure, the nominal growth figure is around 26%, which means inflation. You yourself explained the difference between the real GDP growth and nominal growth rate. So the nominal growth is 26%, and which means almost half of that nominal growth is real and half of that is because of inflation. So I think this is the larger picture that you get. Of course, there are some bright spots in these numbers. For example, the gross capital formation has gone up to 34% of GDP, which is a positive sign. The personal consumption, which means the private consumption of people, which used to be around 56% of the GDP, is now gone up to almost 60% of GDP, which means the economy is being driven by your and mine consumption.
कुल मिलाकर यदि हम एक भी बहुत सामान्य लोगों की भाषा में समझना चाहे तो ये आंकड़े हमें संतोषजनक लग रहे या हमें अच्छी वृद्धि की दिशा में जाने का संदेश दे रहे हैं, और जो हमारे पास उपलब्ध स्थितियां हैं न केवल घरेलू बल्कि वैश्विक परिस्थितियों को ध्यान में रखते हुए इन आंकड़ों को हम क्या कह सकते हैं?
ये आंकड़े जो आपको दिखा रहे हैं वो अप्रैल और जून में आर्थिक गतिविधियों की क्या दिशा थी
जी।
ये आंकड़े आपको यह नहीं बताती कि अगले तिमाही में या उसके बाद के तिमाही में क्या दिशा रहेगी, क्योंकि इस आंकड़ों में से इंटरेस्ट रेट का इम्पैक्ट आधा होगा। 140 बेसिस पॉइंट्स का जो इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ा है उसमें से इन समय में अप्रैल से जून का जो हिस्सा जो है वो आधा से कम होगा हिस्सा। तो मैं मानता हूं कि जो अगली तिमाहियों में जो गतिविधियां की जो दिशा जो होगी उसको तय करेगा किस तरह से अगली तिमाहियों में इंटरेस्ट रेट की डायरेक्शन ट्रैजेक्टरी रहेगी, किस तरह से इन्फ्लेशन इम्पैक्ट होगा, किस तरह से क्रूड ऑयल प्राइसेस के दाम रहेंगे। तो अप्रैल जून की अगर नंबर आप देखेंगे, आप एक रिलीफ सोचेंगे कि हाँ 13.5% की वृद्धि हुई है। ये जो कोई अर्थनीति के लिए एक अच्छी खबर है, पर अगर आपने 7.5% या 7.2% या 7.4% ये सारे आंकड़े विभिन्न संस्थाओं ने दी हैं, अगर पूरे साल की वृद्धि दर की जो बात कर रहे हैं हम वो करना है, तो मैं समझता हूं कि अगले जो 3 जो बाकी तिमाहियां जो हैं इस साल में उनमें वृद्धि दर काफी ऊपर होनी चाहिए, क्योंकि ये वृद्धि दर के बाद जो इम्पैक्ट जो इन्फ्लेशन का इंटरेस्ट रेट का इम्पैक्ट और भी सुदृढ़ हो जाएगा, और भी हमें और इकोनॉमी को और भी जरा लड़ाई करनी पड़ेगी अपनी वृद्धि दर को ऊपर रखने के लिए।
So effectively we are looking at a time lag between the end of June and when the first quarter results are announced, which is 2 months really. That the data is being released right now. So compilation takes time clearly. So we are now actually into the second quarter. So you're saying that it's not providing any guidance for the second quarter.
The second quarter numbers will be available only on the last day of November. So which means you will get to know of what has really happened to the second quarter and the full impact of the 140 basis points interest rate increase, the fuller impact of the crude oil prices increases, and of course the global situation of where everybody is pulling back money and tightening liquidity. So all those things will play out in the next 3 quarters. So therefore what you can safely say is first quarter you have booked your profits, but you do not know what kind of situation awaits you in the next 3 quarters.
Well, one can certainly estimate regarding trade, hotels, transportation, communication and services, which is at 25.7% of the real GDP. Then we have construction segment, which grew 16.8%. Electricity, gas, water supply and other utility services rose 14.7%. So this is clearly something that would be standing. As far as construction is concerned, there is a boom right now, especially on the private and the public side is concerned. But what kind of guidance can you provide in terms of the second quarter and for the rest of the year? Because when we talk about a quarter GDP, we are looking at what the annual GDP is likely to be.
My sense is that in the current year, most probably, we will end closer to 6.5% or 7%. That is because none of those estimates that I talked about as 7.2 or 7.4 has taken into account these additional factors of interest rate hikes, additional factors of a crude oil price increase, additional factors of a global turmoil of sorts, where inflation rate is not just coming under control, and even if you look at what Mr. Jeremy Powell at the that conference, Jackson Hole conference, talked about, that more interest rate hikes are coming. So it will act. So a lot of pressure points seem to be building up, and they need to be tackled. So I would be very happy as an individual if we end the year with a growth rate of closer to 7%.
There's a lot happening in our economy right now. I would like to link the next question to what's happening in the stock market that went up by almost 1,600 points yesterday. We are seeing companies now adopt financial strategies like demergers, spin-offs. We're looking at stock splits of the equity share itself, like what Tata Steel did. And these are ways and means for companies to raise money. So if the central bank is increasing the repo rate, they're trying to arrest inflation, ideally that should help the real GDP figures go up. Businesses need not rely just on bank loans to finance the expenditure, because what they're seeking are working capital. How do you see the estimate of yours of say 6.5 to 7% annually, which means in second, third and the fourth quarter, the growth is likely to be lower? Why?
Certainly, the growth will have to be lower also because of the base effect. Because as you saw in the last year when the recovery was happening, 21-22, the second quarter and the third quarter, the growth decelerated, and that happened because the growth in the previous year had also begun decelerating. Now, this year, you are seeing the additional factors which were not there last year, which, as I mentioned, that the oil price hike, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, you have the global central banks trying to tighten liquidity. So therefore, I for one see that the growth rates will start decelerating. But the point that you mentioned about the stock markets being very, very jubilant, 1,500 points since it's going up yesterday, is also because the stock markets have begun factoring in the kind of the interest rate hikes that will happen, factoring in the kind of oil price movement that may take place, factoring in what the US Russia-Ukraine war might entail. So we are going through a phase where the stock markets are gradually, sort of internalizing the crisis points to a point where they are looking ahead of those crises.
बस इसी मोड़ पर हम श्रोताओं लेना चाहेंगे एक छोटा सा विराम। बने रहिए हमारे साथ, हम फिर से उपस्थित होंगे विराम के बाद लेकर मार्केट मंत्र।
उपभोक्ताओं तक पहुंचने का सुलभ और सस्ता माध्यम है आकाशवाणी।
आकाशवाणी के विभिन्न केंद्रों से कीजिए अपने उत्पादों और सेवाओं का प्रचार विज्ञापनों के माध्यम से।
लोकल और राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर कीजिए अपने बिजनेस का विस्तार, क्योंकि आकाशवाणी में विज्ञापन बुकिंग हुई बहुत ही आसान। अब घर, दफ्तर या दुकान पर बैठे बैठे आप कर सकते हैं विज्ञापनों की बुकिंग। डायल कीजिए 870-001-4242।
नंबर एक बार फिर नोट करें, 870-001-4242।
विराम के बाद एक बार फिर से आपका स्वागत है कार्यक्रम मार्केट मंत्र में। आइए अब चलते हैं शेयर बाजार की ओर। घरेलू शेयर बाजार आज सार्वजनिक अवकाश के कारण बंद रहे। एशियाई बाजारों पर ध्यान दें तो वहां बिकवाली का रुख देखने को मिला है। कल अमेरिका में हुई गिरावट का असर निवेशकों पर एशिया में दिखा, जिसके कारण कुल मिलाकर मुनाफा वसूली की गई। दक्षिण कोरिया का कोस्पी 0.9% घाटे में रहा। चीन के शंघाई कंपोजिट इंडेक्स में 0.8% की गिरावट हुई। सिंगापुर का स्ट्रीट्स टाइम्स इंडेक्स 0.6% नीचे आ गया। जापान का निक्केई 225 0.4% नुकसान के साथ बंद हुआ। हांगकांग के हैंगसेंग में बिना किसी खास उतार चढ़ाव के अपने पूर्व स्तर पर बाजार बना रहा। यूरोपीय शेयर बाजार की ओर चलें तो समाचार तैयार किए जाने तक वहां भी बिकवाली दिख रही थी। अंतर्दिवसीय कारोबार में लंदन का FTSE 100 1.1% नुकसान में था। फ्रांस का CAC 40 0.7% घाटे के साथ चल रहा था, जबकि जर्मनी के डेक्स में 0.3% की गिरावट बनी हुई थी।
AKB, notwithstanding what is happening in the US stock markets, the reaction to the Fed announcement and their views and opinions, not yet a discount rate re-announcement by the Fed Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. What's your take on arresting inflation in Europe? Eurozone is showing inflation at 9.1%. We can directly link it to the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the supply disruption, prices going up. How do you see that impacting sentiment in the Western markets?
Well, I think inflation is a very, very big factor. Until and unless Europe and most of the European nations find a credible and sustainable solution to their gas supplies, and in the run up to the winter season, when the demand for gas goes up, some talks are going on. Probably the gas supplies will be normalized, but they will be normalized at prices that are much higher than what they were a year ago. So therefore, the inflation potential of the European economics is very high, and therefore I wouldn't be surprised if inflation rates remain elevated for a few more months, until and unless the gas supply situation, the food supply situation. Remember, Ukraine and Russia also supply a lot of food grain to the European Eurozone countries. So therefore, both on the food side, commodity side, as well as on the gas side, I think this conflict is going to cost them daily in terms of higher prices. And till that time, I don't see the central banks of these countries, whether it is the Bank of England or whether it is the European Central Bank, they're going to go slow on their monetary policy stance in terms of softening the interest rate policy. Same is true of the US, where they are beginning to realize that even though there are some softening of inflation rates in the US, they are going to tighten the position a little bit, going by what Mr. Powell said, what he said at the Jackson Hole conference. Just a point, although you haven't raised it, just a point on the domestic situation. While our GDP numbers are coming up at 13.5%, today also you have seen the central government's latest 4-month finances figures coming out.
You mean fiscal deficit?
Yeah.
It's come down a little bit.
It's come down, and still no, but 20% is good news, because it clearly shows that the government's fisc is under control, and the tax revenues are still buoyant, even in the 4th month. The GST collections, which will be out next a day later, they are also showing good signs. So what you are seeing is that a kind of a duality, where the government's estimate of the GDP growth of 15.6% for the first quarter has come down to 13.5%, but the government's own estimate of its own public finance collections and expenditure, they are coming as some sort of a relief, because expenditure has been reined in, the revenue expenditure is actually lower, and capex, the capital expenditure, is actually higher. So which is good news again. So the government has kept its books under good shape, whereas the broader economy is probably going through a phase which has been impacted by factors that are quite extraneous.
एक बार फिर से हम आपका ध्यान यूरोप की ओर और यूरोप के साथ साथ कह लें कि विश्व अर्थव्यवस्था में खाद्य संकट की दिशा में ले चलना चाहेंगे. एक और यूरोप में खासतौर से आपने कहा कि यूक्रेन और रूस के बीच जो संघर्ष चल रहा है उसका प्रभाव खाद्य आपूर्ति पर यूरोप में देखने को मिल रहा है. मैं दूसरी तरफ ध्यान दिलाना चाहूंगा जो जलवायु परिवर्तन के कारण इस वर्ष विशेष रूप से खाद्य की उत्पादन पर असर पड़ने की आशंका जताई जा रही है. वैसी स्थिति में विश्व अर्थव्यवस्था में खाद्य उत्पादन की और उसका संकट का आयाम कितना बड़ा हो सकता है और हमारे घरेलू मोर्चे पर हम इससे निपटने में कितने सक्षम दिख रहे हैं?
अगर घरेलू मोर्चे की बात करते हैं हम तो हम ये कह सकते हैं, हम ये देख रहे हैं कि हमारी जो अनाज की जो भंडार जो है वो हालांकि इस वक्त लग रहा है कि नीचे आ गया है, बफर स्टॉक के करीब आ गया है, पर मैं समझता हूं कि अगली सीजन में और रेनफॉल की फोरकास्ट को देखते हुए कि ईस्ट ऑफ इंडिया में अगले 2 हफ्ते की जो बारिश की जो इंडिकेशंस आ रही हैं, एस्टिमेट ये है कि जो राइस की जो आउटपुट जो इस वक्त ज्यादा होती है वो आउटपुट के शॉर्टफॉल जो पहले में जो डर था वो कम हो जाएगा. और अभी तक जो हमारी जो फ्लड सिचुएशन है अभी तक कंट्रोल में है. हालांकि नॉर्थ ईस्ट में बहुत जगह में अभी भी फ्लड्स या उत्तराखंड के कई जगहों में हमने फ्लड की सिचुएशन को कंट्रोल करने में बहुत दिक्कत पड़ी है. पर घरेलू मोर्चों में मैं कहूंगा अनाज की स्थिति अभी भी कंट्रोल में है. सरकार ने भी काफी ऐसे कदम लिए हैं जिससे कि अनावश्यक एक्सपोर्ट्स या ऐसा कोई कंजम्पशन और जो सितंबर के बाद जो गरीब कल्याण योजना का अन्य कल्याण योजना का जो स्कीम जो है उसको और 6 महीने बढ़ाने के या 3 महीने बढ़ाने के ऊपर और भी बहुत कल्पना जल्पना चल रही है. तो वो देखते हुए लगता है कि सरकार भी काफी इसमें
सतर्क है उसका.
पर अगर आप विश्व की ओर देखेंगे तो मैं समझता हूं जरूर हमें एक चेतावनी देती है. अगर आप हमारे पड़ोसी देश पाकिस्तान में देखेंगे उनमें फ्लड में उनके 1/3 उनका क्रॉप आउटपुट खत्म बर्बाद हो चुका है और उनकी अवस्था संगीन है. श्रीलंका में देखिए और कारण है उनके. तो चारों ओर में अगर आप देखें तो जो खाद्य जो अवस्था जो है वो क्लाइमेट चेंज को कहिए या और कोई कारणों के लिए कहिए जो बहुत सेफ नहीं लग रही है. पर मुझे लग रहा है कि ओवरऑल प्रोडक्शन जो विश्व का
वैश्विक उत्पादन होगा
ठीक है, पर स्पेसिफिक कंट्री जो हैं उनकी जो
स्थिति प्रभावित हो सकती
है. AKB, very briefly, we're talking about China and comparing our GDP growth versus their lack of it. The manufacturing, the PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, for the month of August is at 49.4. They have a GDP estimate of 3.5% growth for the year. And this is in the background of, COVID lockdowns in 31 mainland provinces. How do you see that mix with their real estate problems, non-delivery of flats to owners who have already paid for it but haven't taken delivery? How do you see China right now, very briefly, citing this particular?
Well, to the long list of the challenges of the problems that the Chinese economy faces, I will add a little bit about the political uncertainty. There is a possibility of a change in the Chinese leadership in November when there is a People's Congress taking place where the current premier will have to seek a renewal of his leadership for another 10 years. Now that is also going to come up and add a bit of uncertainty. Now, of course, China is a big country. It is the world's second largest economy, and its management of the COVID situation is now looking to be woefully short of the expectations that you would have of a large economy like China. It's clear that their strategy of 100% lockdown and not going in for vaccination in the way other countries have gone in is going to cost them dearly. And my reading is that it is the poor management of the COVID crisis that China will have to pay a huge price for in the days to come in terms of growth as well as the political uncertainty that will grip the nation in the weeks to come.
Moving on to the U.S. stock market, U.S. stocks closed lower for a third straight session yesterday. The three major U.S. indices fell as a rise in job openings fueled fears. The U.S. Fed Reserve has another reason to maintain its aggressive path of interest rate hikes to combat inflation. The Dow Jones Industrial Average Index lost 1%, while the S&P 500, the Nasdaq Composite declined 1.1% each. Moving on to the oil market, oil prices today fell around 2.5% in intraday trade. Brent crude was trading at $96 per barrel, while WTI crude prices were at $89.30 per barrel. Despite the U.S. going through a technical recession and what's happening with the Fed Reserve announcements, their job reports are quite positive. Even for the month of August, they've added 142,000 jobs. How are they managing that? Briefly.
Well, I think what the U.S. is going through is a situation where at one level you have high inflation. At another level, the micro sector is showing a tremendous activity, pace of activity, and which is why you see a lot of jobs that are being created. Now, we still do not know how this apparently conflicting situation is evolving, whether there is a bubble somewhere lurking. Time will only tell what bubble it was. Remember, nobody knew about the financial bubble in 2007-8, so we still do not know what is really going on.
एक भी बड़ा रोचक सा सवाल आपसे पूछ रहा हूं। अमेरिका में शेयर बाजार में पिछले 3 सत्रों में लगातार गिरावट, यूरोप में लगातार गिरावट, एशिया में भी गिरावट, लेकिन अपने यहाँ बाजार फैक्टर इन कर रहा है, तो उसके पीछे कारक क्या, यानी निवेशकों की दृष्टि में भारत सबसे उभरता हुआ ठिकाना दिख रहा क्या?
रियल सेक्टर में अगर हाई फ्रीक्वेंसी इंडिकेटर देखते हैं आप, उसमें सारे सेक्टर्स में ऑलमोस्ट एवरी सेक्टर में बढ़ोतरी दिख रही है। आप काम के सेक्टर में, ऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर एम्प्लॉयमेंट में, अगर आप अगर जो नौकरियों के क्षेत्र में, हर हाउसिंग एक्टिविटी में, कंस्ट्रक्शन एक्टिविटी में, तो मुझे लग रहा है कि स्टॉक मार्केट इस चीज से दिलासा ले रही है कि इकोनॉमी में गर्मी है, तो आशा का कारण भी बन सकता है।
भारत
ये कारण है भारत।
यानी दुनिया की नजरों में हमारी व्यवस्था बेहतर दिख रही, इसीलिए निवेशक हमारे यहाँ पैसा लगा रहे। आइए अंत में चलें सर्राफा बाजार। घरेलू सर्राफा बाजार आज बंद हैं। न्यूयॉर्क मर्केंटाइल एक्सचेंज में सोने का मूल्य अंतर्दिवसीय कारोबार में कमजोरी के साथ $1,722.90 प्रति औंस पर चल रहा था। चांदी भी कमजोरी के साथ $17.95 प्रति औंस पर कारोबार कर रही थी। बस यहीं पर श्रोताओं की ओर से AKB आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
नमस्कार।
And before we close, a reminder of the headlines. GDP of the country grows at 13.5% in the April to June quarter of the current fiscal. Asian stock markets log losses following overnight losses in the US dollar, and Brent crude oil prices fall to trade around $96 per barrel. And that's it in this edition of Market Mantra for now. Goodbye.
Market Mantra, Mantra. Market Mantra, Mantra. Market Mantra. Market Mantra.